And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for an exciting and insightful webinar on leadership and ethics. My name is Asia Marchman, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Engagement based here in New York City, and I work with our regional alumni clubs on the East Coast. This talk is a partnership with the Chicago Booth Alumni Engagement Team and the Chicago Booth Alumni Club of Washington, D.C. Before I introduce our featured speaker and moderator, I would like to quickly go over some housekeeping rules. Your mic will be on mute until we transition to Q&A. Also, please consider using a headset. A private message will be sent only if your audio or video goes out. If this happens, please dial back in using your phone. Now, I would like to introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor John Paul Rollert. Professor Rollert is an adjunct associate professor of behavioral science at the University of Chicago Booth of Business and teaches leadership at the intersection of politics and law at the Harvard Extension School. He teaches, and his teaching and research focuses on the intellectual history of capitalism, the ethics of leadership, and the application of empathy to law, business, and politics. Professor Rollert is the in-house ethicist for the Chicago Booth Review, and his work has been featured in the New Republic, Harper's, Fortune, Bloomberg, the Washington Post, Slate, the Paris Review, and the Atlantic, and the New York Times. Our moderator this afternoon is Tosin Olasolo, Booth class of 2017. She is a seasoned corporate financial professional with Amazon, overseeing free cash flow and profitability strategy. Prior to joining Amazon, Tosin amassed cross-sector experiences across financial services and aviation, where she gained technical proficiency and led financial teams in both operations and technology. Tosin hails from Lagos, Nigeria, and is passionate about community enrichment. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Rollert.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation about a topic that is certainly near and dear to my heart, which is leadership. Let me share my PowerPoint presentation here. All right. So I've titled the talk for today, Power and Persuasion, the Art and Ethics of Leading Others. I want to say a little bit about this particular title for the talk. So what we're going to be looking at with respect to leadership are two different ways of thinking about how we exercise leadership, or really kind of more broadly, authority and control. And that is one kind of vector being power, and the other being persuasion. And I'll talk about how those represent different ways that we think about managing the people around us. And the subtitle I've given is The Art and Ethics of Leading Others. I think the word art bears a little bit of explanation there. What I didn't subtitle it as is the science and ethics of leading others, because leadership is not a science, it's an art. Well, what does that mean? It means leadership is ultimately a matter of practice. What I liken it to is the exercise of learning how to become a potter, right? Let's say you want to kind of create pottery. You have to sit down at the potter's wheel and you have to begin kind of molding the clay and working with the clay. You don't simply read a book. You have to actually learn by doing. Leadership is very much like that. And the art of leadership, using that analogy, is that you are both the potter and the clay. The thing that is doing the shaping, but also the thing that is being shaped. You're shaping yourself in that process. And a lot of what we'll discuss here today is kind of consistent with that, the art that we exercise when we begin managing the people who are around us. But ethics are important as well, too. Why? Because ethics is an engagement of how we end up kind of shaping other people around us, how we inspire them, how we lead them, the way in which we kind of engage other people. And so when you're thinking about leadership, inevitably you're engaged in a kind of ethical practice because you're shaping the people who are around you. And I think that's true of all of us generally when we interact with others, but it's especially true when it comes to matters of leadership. Now, the way I want you to kind of think about this in terms of framing the discussion we're having here today is that leadership is a matter of getting what you want from others, and therefore your orientation toward others is key. If I'm asked to explain what is leadership, leadership is ultimately an exercise of getting others to do what you ultimately want them to do, right? You can't exercise leadership from your cubicle. You exercise leadership by engaging other people and getting them to do, as part of your team or your group, what you want them to do. And therefore, your orientation toward other people is key. The way in which you ultimately engage them with an eye of getting from them what it is you hope to get from them as members of your team or members of your group. Now, to that end, there are these two different approaches, these two different orientations toward other people. The first is inclusive of what I would call power. What can I force or coerce or push other people to do? And the second is persuasion. What can I convince others to do? So you can already see in each of these definitions a very different orientation toward the people around you. When you have the power orientation, you're thinking, what can I essentially force others to do? And with respect to persuasion, what is it I can convince others to do, knowing that they're ultimately always able to leave, right? They can always exit the premises. When you have that power engagement, you understand that either people can exit or that there's a kind of bar to their exiting, that exiting isn't necessarily so easy for them to do. So it isn't merely a matter of whether or not I have to do something, but whether I feel ultimately compelled to do it. Whereas with respect to persuasion, we're talking more about creating a conviction in someone else that this is ultimately what they want to do. And so insofar as you're engaging other people, you're thinking with an eye toward how I can either, again, force them to do things or convince them to do things. Well, let's draw out these two approaches a little more neatly. Let's talk first about power. So the most kind of famous figure when it comes to the power approach to leadership is this gentleman right here, Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a kind of famous aide to powerful individuals in 16th century Florence. He was essentially an aide de camp or a counselor, we might say, to powerful figures. And what he essentially helped them to do is to figure out how they could become princes of essentially principalities. Now, it's important to note that in the 16th century in Italy, you had a series of small warring states. So people were always kind of trying to get the better of one another in these kind of very tense and demanding times. And so the kind of advice that Machiavelli was giving was probably not consistent with what you'd expect in a liberal democracy. It would be consistent with the kind of advice you might give when you're a warlord in a series of small warring states. Consistent with that, in one of his most famous passages, he dispenses the following advice to the prince who might be reading his document. He says, "You must know that there are two kinds of combat, the one by law, the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. Thus, since a prince is compelled of necessity to know well how to use the beast, he should pick the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves. Those who stay simply with the lion do not understand this." Now, this most famous passage from the Prince, there are a couple of things I want to kind of underscore here. So the first is that Machiavelli acknowledges that, in the world of kind of that is proper to men, really proper to angels, law is ultimately what should guide us, kind of clear and simple rules, not necessarily kind of the law of the jungle, so to speak. But insofar as people tend to cheat, get the better of you, or in his world, use violence and force to get what they want, Machiavelli simply says you have to channel these kinds of darker passions. In the one case, you have to use the guile of the fox, right? The trickery of the fox. And on the other hand, you have to use the brute force of the lion. But importantly, he says, and this is why in many respects we think of Machiavelli as kind of the godfather of strategic thinking, you don't use always one or the other. You use each of these methods when appropriate. So insofar as brute force is sometimes necessary, you channel the lion, but oftentimes simple trickery is necessary. So you're prepared to use the fox, and you have to move back and forth between them. And in fact, if you were to read more of Machiavelli, he says also at times you have to use the laws of men as well. You have to be willing to kind of move between these different types of strategies in order ultimately to bring about the desired effect that you ultimately have. Now, it's true that insofar as this describes a kind of orientation toward other people around us, The power approach is consistent with thinking of people as objects and not subjects. What do I mean by that? The power approach views human beings as players on a chessboard that can be moved essentially at your whim. You don't think of them as subjects that you engage, as individuals who have their own kind of personal dignity and respect that has warranted them. You think of them merely as vessels for your own ambition. How is it I get from them ultimately what I want so that I can reach my goals? That kind of approach, as I've suggested, thinks of people as objects rather than subjects. Now, at the extreme, we might think of this playing out here with our friend Kim Jong-un sitting very happily in front of what presumably is one of his North Korean subs. If you're in Kim Jong-un's North Korea, why do you do what Kim Jong-un asked you to do? Well, the reason is very simple. Very bad things will happen to you, your family, and your friends. This is kind of power at the absolute level. Force is used to get what you want, and it's assumed that you will do what Kim Jong-un asks, because otherwise, as I suggested, unpleasant things will end up happening to you and the people you care about most. Well, now many of you might be saying, well, that may be true, but in my own kind of corporate or business situation, this is not the kind of exercise that I'm typically engaged in. And that's absolutely true. I mean, we're lucky enough to live in a liberal democratic world where the use of kind of power in traditional circumstances is not something that we typically accept. But there are other ways that we tend to use force, and that is through, on the one hand, incentives, and on the other hand, threats. We think of this as carrots and sticks. We offer incentives to people to get them to do not what they necessarily want to do because they're excited about the project or the initiative at hand, but because they desire something. We give them effectively money, power, or status to get them to do what we want them to do. And that's, again, thinking of them certainly as objects. In terms of threats, we offer them demotion, the lack of promotion, or simply firing. These are the kinds of threats that we use consistent with exercises in power. And what I would suggest to you is that this gives you, I think, two different ways of thinking about the engagement of a leader versus what I would call a boss in a kind of complex corporate setting. If you are a boss, you can think of your task as typically like pushing the boulder up the hill. And the important thing to note is if you're engaged with other people in this fashion, you can be successful. Plenty of us have had pushy, aggressive bosses who essentially force us to do, by pushing us, by using carrots and sticks, what they want us to do. But when I'm analyzing someone's leadership, the first question I ask is, are you successful? And you can be successful in pushing that boulder to the top of the hill. But then the second question I ask is, well, how efficient were you in that process? What does your team look like at the very end of it? Have you broken the team apart by getting to that finish line? And what is the reputation that you've ultimately cultivated for yourself? Are you someone that people are eager to work with? If the answer to all of those questions is no, or I've broken my team up, you may be successful in accomplishing the task at hand. However, you've done so in a way that's wildly inefficient. And the upshot of that is that you're going to have to overpay people for the task at hand, and you're going to end up squandering a lot of the goodwill you could otherwise build up. And you're constantly going to have to be rebuilding teams because people are defecting. And for any of us who have been in leadership situations, the most valuable thing that we have are good people. And if so much of your engagement in this power sense is engaging people in a way that makes them look for the exit, you're not actually being a particularly efficient leader. I would say more that you're being a boss. And you're going to have to overpay people in order to join your team. And highly qualified people will always be looking for the exit. Why? Because they aren't excited to work with you. And you end up kind of creating an environment consistent ultimately with burnout. Being a leader rather than a boss, I think, is a very different type of exercise. And what I liken it to is, as opposed to pushing the boulder up the hill, it's rolling the boulder down the hill. Now, it's true that you have to put some force in to get that boulder moving, but then the momentum of leadership takes over. People are enthusiastic about the job at hand. They're inspired by it. They want to be part of your team. What you're doing is building up the faith, loyalty, and trust that is consistent with exercises in leadership. And when you're doing that, and of course, we've all been part of teams where the enthusiasm takes over, your job as someone managing more broadly some kind of enterprise is much easier. People are more excited. They're more enthusiastic. The momentum of leadership ends up taking over. And getting that boulder to the bottom of the hill is much easier than rolling it to the very top of the hill. And so again, when I'm doing a kind of analysis of individuals' capacity for leadership, I'm again not just looking toward, did you succeed at the task? That's question one. The question two is, how successful were you in terms of efficiency and keeping that strong team together and attracting the best talent? The more that you're engaged in kind of persuasion, as opposed to activities of power, I tend to think the more successful you will ultimately be. Well, we've talked about kind of the apotheosis of kind of the power approach in Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. What does the persuasion approach potentially look like? Again, I go back to this idea of the orientation toward others. In the power approach, you're looking at people as objects to kind of move around, to push and pull essentially at will. You're never relying on their own personal momentum in order to kind of get the job ultimately done. You're always thinking in terms of carrots and sticks. With respect to the persuasion orientation, you're thinking of people as subjects rather than objects, as individuals who have their own goals, their own concerns, their own beliefs, and ultimately their own momentum as they make their way through this world. Your responsibility is to engage them as subjects rather than think about, how do I end up forcing everyone in the direction I'm ultimately hoping to get them. And so in that respect, it's important to note that I would say the most famous example of how we think about persuasion comes in respect to this book, Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. Now, for many of you, I suspect you're probably actually far more familiar with this book than Machiavelli's The Prince, even though you've no doubt heard of at least Machiavellianism. In many respects, we are kind of the children of this approach to leadership. Dale Carnegie first wrote this book in the 1930s. He was actually a traveling door-to-door salesman selling vacuums. I don't know about you, but I can't think of too many jobs I would less prefer than going door-to-door selling vacuums. Why? Because when you knock on someone's door and they see you standing there, you're the last person they want you to see. No one wakes up in the morning and says, I hope someone will come knocking on my door trying to sell me a vacuum. But Dale Carnegie was rather gifted at this. In fact, he was so good at going door to door selling vacuums, he had fellow salesmen kind of ask him, well, like, tell me how you do this. Give me advice so that I can be successful at this as well too. Because what they appreciated is that when you go and knock on someone's door, they don't have to buy your vacuum. There's no real carrot or stick you can use. You can't overwhelm someone. Someone is always free to shut the door in your face. So if you can convince them to do what it is you want them to do in this situation, which is to buy your vacuum on that first contact when you have no relationship, and get them enthusiastic enough that when you leave their porch, they've purchased a vacuum, that is a tremendous exercise in persuasive influence. And so these fellow vacuum cleaner salesmen or traveling salesmen wanted to know what were Dale's secrets. So Carnegie began giving these presentations at the local YMCA that were wildly popular. And then he ultimately ended up writing this particular book. Now, many of you may be familiar with this book. Tens of millions of copies of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People have been sold. It's translated into every language under the sun. And in fact, in most certainly well-developed parts of the world, you can actually take courses in kind of the Dale Carnegie method. I'm going to give you a very basic sense of what's in this book, because I think what it will suggest is a very different way of how you orient yourself toward other people to get what it is you want from them. And so if you were to read Dale Carnegie's book, you'd read 80 pages, and then you would get to a series of 10 takeaway lessons. In those 80 pages, you get a bunch of stories and anecdotes from Dale Carnegie's life on the road. And then you get 10 takeaway lessons. Now, there are 3 parts of the book. In each part, it's the same method, 80 pages of stories and anecdotes, 10 takeaway lessons. What I'm going to do is quickly run through the 10 takeaway lessons for each of the 3 parts. It's important to note that you should see how these build on one another. That we start with become a friendlier person. This is kind of the first strategy. And this is the first thing you have to do on the way to kind of being successful in leadership. And so you get suggestions like, don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Remember that a person's name is to that person the most important sound in any language. But I think importantly toward the end, talk in terms of the other person's interest. Make the other person feel important and do so sincerely. So I think the first thing that I should note here is that, as Carnegie suggests, the first approach is not to make other people feel that you're impressive. It's to make them feel that they're impressive and you're inclined toward them. So the orientation toward other people, the kind of energy flow is outward rather than inward, right? If you're thinking in power terms, you're almost thinking in primal terms of kind of chest beating impressiveness. What Carnegie is suggesting, look, in our modern free world, where anyone is always free to go to the exit, what you have to do is make other people feel important by making yourself a friendlier person, right? There's nothing about Machiavelli's The Prince that suggests that the way to kind of leadership and success is being a friendly person. This is a fundamentally different kind of approach, one that I think is very familiar to us today, but nearly a century ago seemed entirely novel when Dale Carnegie was first giving his lessons at the YMCA. Once you've succeeded in making yourself a friendlier person, you begin to kind of win people to your way of thinking, right? So you've made yourself a friend, a trusted individual, and now you begin to win people to your way of thinking. But again, the advice here has an outward orientation rather than an inward orientation. Begin in a friendly way. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking. And most importantly, I think, and most interestingly, let the other person feel that the idea is his or hers. We all know that when we're managing teams, if people feel as though they have ownership of the idea, they're much more excited about it. No one wants to willingly sign on to your vanity enterprise. You might be able to pay them to do so. You might be able to kind of strike fear in them to do so. But to get their general enthusiasm, they have to feel that it's their project, their enterprise, as opposed to yours. And what Carnegie suggests here is, to the degree you get them to believe that the idea is not your idea, but our idea, you're well on your way to kind of convincing people to think about the world and engage the world the way you'd like them to. And this culminates in be a leader, right? He says, look, if your desire is to exercise leadership, you begin with this sense of friendliness that allows you to be an influential person and ultimately allows you in turn to become a leader with respect to others. And so again, the kinds of advice that is given here is consistent with this outward orientation. Ask questions instead of giving direct orders. Give the other person a fine reputation to live up to. Use encouragement, make the fault seem easy to correct. So all of this is about sustaining what I'm calling this momentum of leadership, keeping people kind of moving successfully in the same direction. The more that you're ultimately doing that, the more you are inspiring people to be part of a project rather than making them feel as though they're forced to be along for the ride. And so what I would suggest is, with regard to this kind of persuasion approach to leadership, there are two key ideas I want to communicate to you. The first is this idea of outward energy. It's, to me, the kind of chief takeaway lesson from Andrew Carnegie's book, which is the more that you turn the energy outward to make people feel important and significant, the more likely you are to get that inspiration, loyalty, faith, and commitment that is consistent with not being a boss, but really being a leader. Again, you're not trying to turn the energy inward to demonstrate to people that you're so great. You're turning that energy outward to inspire them to want to work on a common project. And secondly, the cultivation of empathy. If you have an inward energy, right, if you're pulling people in, all you are thinking about is, how do I show how great I am? You're stuck in your head the whole time. The engagement of Carnegie is much more, and I would say the persuasion engagement generally is all about the cultivation of empathy. How do I understand your needs and concerns, where you're coming from, so that I can connect those with my needs and concerns that get me toward a common project? The more that you're excited about the destination we're going toward, the harder you're going to pull on those oars. And we all have to pull together as a team to get to that destination. By contrast, if it's a slave's galley, if you're chained to the oars or someone is banging the drum at the very beginning, you might get there, but we all know you're not going to get there nearly as fast. And in a world where we essentially can't use force in a more traditional way, what that effectively means in a corporate setting is we're going to have to wildly overpay people and strike fear into them. And we all know that that doesn't mean you ultimately get the very best performance. So for me, what this ultimately leads to are a few kind of key takeaways from our time together. And then we're going to open up Q&A. and have more of a conversation around these matters. The first key takeaway is that power is an exercise in force and persuasion is an exercise in enticement. Again, when you're thinking in power terms, when you're acting more like a boss, you're thinking, what can I force or coerce other people ultimately to do? You're always thinking in terms of kind of questions of leverage, particularly in a corporate environment. Whereas persuasion is a question of enticement. If I acknowledge that you can do what you want to do because you are a free adult, you can always go to the exit. I'm always thinking about how do I kind of entice you into the process of being engaged in this project. And what I want to suggest is this is especially true when it includes the very kind of people who are together for this conversation today. Why? You're all high performers. You're all highly desirable individuals to have on your team. When you're a Booth graduate, I want you on my team because you have great capabilities and the aptitude consistent with getting the project done. However, what that means is that you individually have a lot of choices. And so I have to find a way to get you on my team. Now, it's true. I don't want to forget what you learned in a lot of your finance classes. That means I'm going to have to probably offer you some money and some power in order to kind of be engaged in the project. But if that's the only type of enticement you're given, I know that I'm not going to get your best effort, and you're always going to be looking for the exit. How do I entice you to feel part of this project in a way that ultimately elicits your best effort? Number two, force can be successful, but compared with persuasion, it is exhausting, time-consuming, and inefficient. Don't misunderstand me. The power approach consistent with the boss often gets a lot done. But when you are constantly thinking in force terms, right, in power terms, you can be successful, but as compared with persuasion, it's time-consuming, it's exhausting, and most importantly, it's tremendously inefficient. You're going to have to overpay for underperformance. The third lesson as a takeaway is that power is the weapon of the boss, persuasion is the tool of the leader. Be a leader, not a boss. You'll see in that kind of final sentence there, I would say this is where ethics really comes in. When you're engaging other human beings, you're always kind of shaping them in some way. And I tend to think it is much better to orient yourself toward being a leader, toward inspiring people, toward building faith, trust, and loyalty, and a commitment to the project at hand, than to simply treat people ultimately as objects, which is effectively what you're committing yourself to when you're using the weapon of the boss, which is power. Persuasion, on the other hand, is to me a much more humane tool to use. I also think it's a much more efficacious tool as well. So my own feeling as someone who teaches not only leadership, but also business ethics is that orient yourself toward being a leader rather than a boss. Number four, leadership is an other-focused art, one that relies on outward energy and empathy. Again, if you're engaged in leadership rather than bossism, it's an outward-focused art. You're always engaging other people, listening to them, trying to figure out how you elicit their best performance. And this relies on outward energy and making people feel important, but also empathy as well, too. How do you connect with individuals and understand where they're coming from so their needs and your needs can be one? And then finally, successful leaders cultivate allies rather than merely assembling hired hands. When the only engagement you have with people is consistent with bossism, when you're effectively using carrots and sticks, all you have are hired hands. And the contract with a hired hand ends when you're no longer paying them or when someone else can pay them more. Leaders are always thinking about cultivating allies. How do I cultivate allies who will help me kind of toward the goal? Allies are not necessarily hired hands. Hired hands are there only, again, insofar as the check clears or they don't have a better opportunity. Allies, on the other hand, are committed to the goal at hand, invested in the project. And what that ultimately means is that you get the best performance from them. And insofar as leadership is an art oriented toward getting people to do what you want them to do and get the best performance from them, if you think about creating allies rather than gathering hired hands, I think you'll be more successful in your own efforts to be a leader, regardless of the capacity in which you're exercising that leadership. And so with that, I will thank you all, and we'll open it up to questions. And I'll hand that back to Tosin to get the conversation started.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Rollert. That was fantastic. That was fantastic. You had me jotting down, I think, throughout your entire speech. So very excited. So for the folks on the call, I just want to let everyone know the Q&A portal is open. So as you have questions, please submit them. And I want to make sure we get to all questions before we are timed out. So Professor Rollert, you shared, and please feel free to use the raise hand feature or come off mute or come off video if you'd like. So you mentioned a couple of really important things that resonated very strongly. I loved how you sort of, teased out for us that the most valuable asset leaders have is having good people. I couldn't agree with that more in practice. I love sort of the framework you shared, which is we do have to put effort towards making sure that we have a friendly disposition, outward disposition, towards our team, our stakeholders. That enables us to garner influence, and that gives us a platform to actually lead. I think that was very well said. And then your last, point that I loved, which is beware of trying to bring people onto your vanity enterprise. I really liked your play on words there. So with that, one of the first questions that I want to talk about. So for the folks on the call, we actually did, sort of poll our alumni community in the Washington, D.C. area. And there was a very common theme that came up around motivating teams. So at the beginning of your presentation, you spoke about, orienting ourselves towards others. Can you share a little bit for the audience, your insights on, how do we really sort of pull on that lever to motivate a team or sort of turn around demotivation as it exists on our teams?
So I think it's a great question, Tosin. And the answer is probably going to be very straightforward, but one that's very hard to implement, which is you have to allocate time to people. Time is the most valuable asset that all of us had, and it's always stretched, especially the more successful you get. There are more and more people competing for your time. But you have to find ways to allocate time into people to kind of understand them, to learn their needs and concerns, and to make them feel as though you don't just view them as tools in your toolbox, right? That's what a hired hand is. There's not the expectation of any kind of human personal relationship. I'm here to do a job and then I leave. I don't have any, to some extent, you're like the hired gun who rides into town and then rides out, right? The hired gun has no friends in the town. His family's not in the town. He doesn't really care about the town. He's just there to do a job. Well, if I'm leading a group of people and that's all that they feel about the work at hand, probably I'm not going to get the best performance. And certainly in terms of building a team, they're not going to be reliable in any way. So I have to find ways to kind of allocate and spend time with kind of team members. And I'll give you an example that I use when I teach leadership at Harvard during the summer. I have an early dinner with all of my teaching assistants, and I use the 80-20 rule when I go to the dinner, which is we spend basically 80% of the time, and it's the first 80% just having a conversation, getting to know them. I want them to get to know one another because often these teaching assistants don't know one another. And I want them to enjoy a dinner. We have a good time and we only get to business at the very end. If you're to flip that, what I would suggest to everyone is that means that business is what's important and you're not ultimately important. But I have to suggest to them that I'm willing to allocate this time because I care about them individually. And at the end, we will kind of turn our focus and go into kind of business. If you're only engaging the people you work with in this hyper-professional capacity, you're treating them essentially as tools. And so what you have to do instead is kind of allocate the time to get that kind of human relationship consistent with faith, trust, and loyalty, which orients you toward leadership. Now, what happens when you are engaged in a team where that seems to be failing somehow? How do you reset those things? I'll admit that that's very difficult. So much of kind of leadership is setting a good standard and then holding people to it. If the standard's kind of gotten out of joint, how do you kind of bring people back in? I would suggest that's very difficult. I think sometimes as a leader, you have to acknowledge that you've failed. You have to acknowledge that we haven't done this as well as we can. And I think often when you're dealing with a kind of a team that is a little bit diseased, what you have to do is then allocate time for individual members to reconnect with them, to understand their own frustrations, and to, at the very least, get them reconnected to you before you can maybe reconnect them to everyone else. Again, all of this requires time, and you can understand why someone might kind of veer more toward that power approach. Well, just give me the amount of money I need to get the job done, or let me rule by fear to get the job done. Sometimes that is a cure-all in the short term, but I tend to think at the very least it creates teams that are where you're very likely to lose people. So even if you get the job done, the minute someone has an opportunity to head for the exit, they will. And then you're stuck with having to spend even more time to ultimately bring new people aboard.
Yeah, that's so important, and it's so useful because we are sort of in a season, I will speak for myself, in the tech sector where we are facing layoffs. So there's an issue of demotivation that's very, very real that's happening across multiple sectors right now. Thank you, Professor Rollert, for that. So we do have questions coming in. So I want to make sure we definitely get the questions in from the audience. Daniel William, his question is, how does this approach translate to leader peers in a business? Does the approach change?
It's a great question. I think that when you are dealing with peers, well, first of all, if they're peers, they're somewhat on an equal plane. So what I would suggest just straightforwardly is when you are in a community of equals, right? One of the dangers is trying to treat them in a way as if they're subordinate to you. So in a longer version of this presentation, I actually start with a famous historical vignette, which is the assassination of Julius Caesar. And so for those of you who might remember a little bit of your Roman history, Caesar was an aristocrat in the Roman Republic and a great general, but he decided that being even the first among equals was not good enough for him. And there was a real fear that he was essentially going to declare himself a tyrant, or effectively the emperor of Rome. And famously, on the Ides of March, he was assassinated by his fellow senators. If you've ever had a chance to watch Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, the way that he presents this particular passage, I think, is really actually quite compelling, in part because he shows Caesar as someone who is kind of tone deaf to the world around him, right? Someone who thinks of himself. He says, he likens himself to the North Star, whose true fixed and resting quality there is no fellow in the firmament. He says, the skies are painted with unnumbered sparks. They all are fire and all doth shine, but there is one who holds his ranked, unshaked of motion. What he means by that is I'm the North Star and you all revolve around me, right? And the problem is that we've all been in groups. What I liken it to is I suspect you might have had an experience like this at college or perhaps even at Booth, where you have a group task and someone just assumes that he or she is going to lead everybody else from moment one. And our reaction, I can see kind of toast and smile, like our reaction when you have someone like that is you're like, well, who does this self-important jerk think he or she is, right? They haven't shown me that somehow they're worthy of leadership. So when dealing with kind of peers, I think you have to be very sensitive to on the one hand, coming off as kind of presumptuous, which is tremendously obnoxious to other people. On the other hand, you have to recognize that you're actually, when it comes to leadership, you're typically contesting something that others want. So you have to kind of find ways to demonstrate to others that you are prepared for the challenge of leadership. There is a certain kind of competition that tends to go on, but I think you do that by bringing in ultimately the best results. In most business environments, if I'm with a group of leaders, we all have teams and we're all producing results. And so it becomes, frankly, straightforward and obvious over time who's doing the best work at his or her job. Now, that's very different if I simply kind of presume that I'm better than everyone. And again, I was having a conversation with a friend over the weekend from law school, and we were reflecting on some of our classmates. And there was one person who stood out to us for always exercising that kind of presumptuousness. And what I can say is this person now, more than 10 years on, the great failure for him is he's not actually cultivated any allies among his peers. Mm-hmm. And so what I always think about when I'm with a group of leaders is how do I make them my allies? Because I'm going to win by addition, even when it comes to dealing not just with members of my team, people who are maybe subordinate to me, but people who are my peers. Thinking in ally terms, I think, is always strategically smart, even when you're dealing with people who want the same thing that you ultimately desire.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you for that, Professor Rollert. So we have a couple more questions. So this is coming from one of your former students, Jason Foster. It's a class of 2018. Jason's question is this: in your approach or framework of being sure to treat people as subjects versus objects, and specifically regarding your second key takeaway about force, Is there a space for ethical paternalism, maybe akin to nudges and so-called libertarian paternalism? Or maybe in situations where you are philosophically convinced that using a hard power approach is really the best for furthering someone's future autonomy. Maybe thinking about the seatbelt laws. How might you think about this as a possible tool alongside the persuasion approach? That was a great question.
Well, I would expect a great question from Jason. Thank you so much for that question. So what I would suggest to you is it's important to know that when you are talking about the persuasion approach, you are obviously affecting other people, right? I mean, if we use a term like persuasion and we use a term like manipulation, they resemble one another, and the fine line between them tends to be one of ethical disposition. Sometimes we think when we're influencing other people it's consistent with persuasion, and sometimes we think we're just manipulating them. And typically it says a lot about how we engage them, and again, the ends to which we're engaging them. But I think with respect to kind of a broader paternalism, especially if I have younger people on my team, they're looking to you to understand how they go about doing things. And I think typically, if you're unwilling to engage any kind of persuasion, well, then leadership is not ultimately for you. And not all persuasion is manipulation, right? You couldn't be a parent or frankly a good friend if you didn't try to persuade the people you care about to ends that you think are beneficial to them. I think you always have to respect someone's autonomy. I don't think you should engage in trickery, but certainly it's the case when I'm dealing, say, for example, with teaching assistants, right? A group that I tend to manage, or when I'm mentoring I have a few former students who have startups that I advise, and when I'm mentoring them, helping them think through how they can kind of best achieve their leadership, I'm trying to push them in certain directions because I'm recognizing that perhaps in certain respects they're not succeeding so much. For me, there's nothing morally problematic with that kind of engagement. Now, when it comes to kind of upping the ante and using, as you suggested, hard power or kind of carrots and sticks, which I think is different than often nudging. Nudging is a question of how you design certain decision sets in order to kind of encourage people in the right direction. Hard power thinks more, someone chose A and you have to shove them into B, right? As opposed to, I'm going to give you choice A and B, and I'm going to nudge you in the direction of kind of A. I think it's somewhat of a more difficult matter. The answer that I would give, I'm going to give two answers, and they'll be a little bit at odds with each other. It's a good academic answer in that regard. I think for the most part, engaging people in a way where you're using that hard power is just typically not especially efficient, right? I recently had to kind of exercise a little bit of hard power with one of these people I advise because he was just making some of the wrong mistakes. And it's difficult because you're essentially engaging people in a way that's inconsistent with what you've done before. And it can create a sense of distrust or wonderment, or people can feel ashamed. And what I would say to you is, in my experience, exercising hard power only works if you've already built up a great deal of trust and you're essentially engaging what I might call the mean mommy moment, right? There are moments with our parents, I love both my parents, where they had to take a kind of stronger tone, but to the degree that we listened to them when they took that stronger tone. I think of my father in this way. My father is a very gentle person, but every once in a while he would move into the stronger tone, right? More of the hard power. I knew that he had my best interest at heart. We had a strong sense of trust, and I knew that he would only do that if he felt I wasn't listening or I was making a great mistake. So I think the exercise of hard power works only when it's not what you typically use, right? If you're always wielding carrots and sticks, it's what people expect. But when you're typically a very persuasive person, building allies, looking out for others, and you shift, what you're typically doing is bringing to the attention of someone else that they're making a mistake, that they're failing, and frankly, that they're failing you individually. And if you have a great deal of trust in that process, I think it can often be really very powerful, but I will say it's a very high stakes engagement, because if you get it wrong, you can destroy all that faith, trust, and loyalty you had before. So you may turn people in the right direction. And look, I've had experiences where moving into that mode have been quite successful. And in fact, most of the times I've done this, because I'm very sparing with it, it's been quite successful. But I can also think of at least one example where the hard power, I probably used a little more than I perhaps should have. And it really compromised the trust I have with the other person. So I think, a kind of paternalism is fine because it's consistent with trying to persuade people and mold them in the right direction, as long as you're not manipulative in the actions you take. But moving into hard power is a very different type of engagement. I would suggest using it very sparingly. I would think of it as, again, the moment when someone you trust has come to you and had a very honest conversation that's not pleasant and has kind of maybe pushed you in a way that you didn't immediately like. But because you believed in them and you had that sense of faith, trust, and loyalty, you were ultimately comfortable with it. The more that you're exercising hard power in that respect, the more I think it becomes a tool in your toolkit consistent with leadership. But it's a great question, Jason. Thank you for it.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have another question here by Greg Gosak. Greg, forgive me if I mispronounced your last name. Greg's question is this: what are the limitations and opportunities of a leader over boss orientation when applied in a context of dealing with external competitors?
So it's a great question. The one thing I'll say about external competitors is that obviously there are different teams that we operate in, right? The company that you're part of is kind of broadly speaking your team. Then you have an immediate team that you're managing, right? They're often teams within teams. But what I would suggest is that when I'm thinking about leadership, properly speaking, I'm thinking about the people who are under my suasion, right? So the people who are ultimately accountable to me. If someone is kind of competition, I don't have the same sets of responsibilities. Then you have to think about kind of an ethics of competition, which to me is a slightly different topic. I think if you're thinking of another company, well, they are your competition as long as you're following the laws and comporting yourself more or less in a reasonably moral fashion. I think there's an understanding that I don't have a leadership responsibility toward them because they're not under my domain. It's a little bit more complex when you're talking about teams within teams, right? You're all part, or most of you, I suspect, are part of kind of very complex hierarchical corporate institutions that contain sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of people. So those are teams within teams. I think I would give more prudential advice. I think if I'm on a team within a kind of large corporate setting, and I think of another team as a rival, at the end of the day, we're also on the same team of a different kind. And so the more that I'm exercising kind of competition and using some of the dark arts of success in order to be successful, the problem is that there's an understanding, one, of fair play. And insofar as we're both part of the same broader team, you're going to probably be seen as violating certain kinds of notions of fair play. And on the other hand, the kind of personal reputation you get within that broader group and that broader environment is problematic. We've all been part of organizations where someone is referred to as cutthroat, and it's not exactly a compliment, right? That doesn't mean that it is entirely disparaging, right? Sometimes it can mean someone is incredibly hardworking, always looking for the best angle and trying to get ahead. But what it also means is that's not someone you trust. It's not someone you want on your team. And probably it's not necessarily someone you want to work for either. Because essentially, if your interests and their interests are at odds, they're always going to favor their interests. And frankly, their disposition is not to think in terms of your interests. That's not their orientation. Their orientation is not outward. Their orientation is very much inward. So I think with respect to kind of a competitive environment, I would make the distinction between kind of whether or not someone can properly be understood as part of your team. And look, if you're both working in the same company or for the same organization, they're part of your team. And if it's a different rival organization, I think it's very different. If you're within an organization, I just think you have to be very careful. Your reputation is something you live with and take with you. It takes a long time to build up. It's like a sandcastle, right? Sandcastles, if they're really lovely, take a long time to kind of build up and you can quickly break them down. Then you have to spend a long time to build them up again. Reputations are very much like that. And so I would more tend to rely on kind of, showing proven results, building great teams, and building the kind of word of mouth consistent with people wanting to work with you and looking to you for leadership. The metaphor that I use in my leadership classes is one of the crown of leadership. A lot of people want to put the crown on their own head. And I, again, liken this to the example of a team effort where someone just steps up, you've met for the first time at booth, and someone is like, all right, well, I'm just going to tell you what to do. You're going to do this, you're going to do this, and you're going to do this. our reaction is that person is trying to put the crown on his or her head, and we don't tend to like those individuals very much. By contrast, people tend to put the crown on you, right? That's typically the way people are crowned, the exception of Napoleon, who famously took the crown and put it on his own head. We're going to put Napoleon aside. When, a king is formally crowned, you put the crown onto his head. And that's what leadership is all about. People look to you for leadership. They're putting the crown of leadership on your head. They're electing you to take over a team or to manage an enterprise. And so your question has to be, how do I get people to look to me for leadership? Now, it's very different from, say, the example of someone like Machiavelli, where he's thinking about how do I use force to wrest the crown from your head. I would say in a kind of decent and humane environment, which is most environments we occupy in a liberal democratic world, it will be such that you're going to try to kind of convince people to put the crown on your head rather than to force it. You really kind of can't force it, especially in an environment you don't control. It's arguably a little bit different if you're the founder of your own startup. Then you've kind of put the crown on your head to begin with, and you're trying to convince people as you go along it deserves to be there. But if you're in a complex corporate environment, you're always looking for others to elect you to that next rung on the ladder of success. And so that means, again, that sense of outward kind of connection, rather than forcing people to put the crown on your head. That tends not to work.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I love the analogy of the crown on the head. I think it builds like such a great imagery. Okay, so I think we have room for one more question. So this is sort of like a question that sort of came in earlier, Professor Rollert, and it builds on, when we think about our reputational capital, right? It takes, as you said, a really long time to build. Now, as we get higher and higher into our leadership ranks, ambiguity becomes more and more of a key feature. I think all of us have a perfect example from the pandemic that we're just coming out of. But then we also realize more and more that we have to sort of harness our ability to take calculated risks, right? And sometimes when problems or choices present themselves, what mental model can we employ to sort of at least come to a decision for ourselves where we're willing to sort of go it alone if we don't have the enabling support from our peers?
I think it's a great question. And here's the way that I would answer it for this particular audience. The way that I think about a booth education, or frankly, any kind of elite education, is that it's the best insurance policy money can't buy, right? Because here's the dirty little secret. If you leave your job tomorrow, what's the worst that's going to happen? Nothing too bad, right? People are excited to have you as part of their teams. You'll always have the opportunity to find another opportunity. You'll always have the chance to find another job opportunity out there, right? In fact, I think one of the most regrettable kind of qualities sometimes I see with booth students is that they get that booth degree and then they're always incredibly risk averse. To me, that's like, buying a Ferrari and then buying a really expensive insurance policy on the Ferrari and leaving it in the garage the whole time. Drive the Ferrari. And so while it's true, it's hard to say sometimes when that moment comes when you should be willing to take a chance and strike out on your own. What I would say is that insofar as you bear in mind that you have this incredible insurance policy, insurance allows you to take risks, right? If you're never driving the Ferrari, there's no reason to have insurance in the first place. Having a booth degree is that incredible insurance policy that should allow you to take risks. I'll give you the example from my own life. When I graduated, I went to Yale Law School and I had a PhD, and I was going to take a very unconventional route. And my father, doing what fathers should, came to me and kind of said, well, you should think about maybe going to a law firm or maybe getting a good consulting job, as opposed to trying to do this writer, adjunct professor kind of route you're going to do, because you realize that route wouldn't return, at least at the very beginning, much money at all. And I said to my father at the time, this is, now about 13 years ago, I said to him, look, again, consistent with this metaphor, I have this incredible insurance policy from my education. Give me a couple years. And if I can't work these things out, I have that insurance policy. I'll make use of it. And I will find my way to Gibbs and Dunn and Crutcher or BCG or someplace that will pay me just fine. but I'm lucky enough to have this education. I'm lucky enough to have this Ferrari. Let me go drive it for a while. And if I crash it, I have the insurance policy and I'll end up being just fine. So what I would say, Tosin, in response to you is that I think a lot of Boost students have this risk analysis way off, in part because one of the qualities of being risk averse is you know which boxes to check, you know how to please people, you know how to climb that ladder really fast. It's one of the reasons you got to Booth in the first place. But I think it takes a kind of recalibration sometimes to appreciate how blessed and privileged you all are. I am, by virtue of having this education. And the best thing you can do with that amazing insurance policy is to actually take some risks when they're warranted. So there's a question of, when am I better staying here in terms of my professional career as opposed to leaving? And that's a different question. What I'm suggesting is, if you find yourself in a position thinking about the possibility of striking out and worrying about what is the worst that could happen, I'm here to tell you the worst is really not so bad. So don't be afraid to take those risks.
Thank you. And with that, I think we are almost at time. So Professor Rollert, thank you so much. On behalf of the DC Alumni Club, thank you so much for your insights. Thank you so much for the framing and so much of the rich context. To our participants, thank you so much for the fantastic questions that came through the Q&A. Definitely took my intellectual curiosity to a higher level, so I appreciate that.